From 2013, after the close of Strikeforce, arguably until PFL took over in 2020, Bellator FC was the number 2 MMA promotion in the world. Hands down, unless you actually believe the numbers coming out of ONE FC, which don't. Just don't. Especially in the North American market, Bellator was hands down number 2, and for a while it was pretty much like TNA to UFC's WWE. That is pretty apt since they both followed to Spike TV right after the flagship promotion left for greener pastures. During those years, Bellator was a breeding ground for some insanely exciting fights and some great talent. They produced some incredible champions. The problem was during that time, several of them transitioned to the UFC, and there's no nice way to say it. They all failed. But the question is why? Why would champions, some incredibly dominant champions, double champs, multi-time champs, defending champs, some who never even lost, fail so badly in the UFC? And when I say fail, it's not even close. Of the 7 champions who transitioned from Bellator to the UFC, they had a combined Bellator record of 86-16. Many of those losses were to each other. Versus transitioning to the UFC, they went 14, 26-3. Only one champ who held it for a cup of coffee, which was Eddie Alvarez, winning the title on a fight night card, and let's be honest, a pretty fluked victory against RDA, and then loses it almost immediately to Conor McGregor. And Lyman Good, their first welterweight champion, couldn't even make it onto the Ultimate Fighter house in his first UFC attempt. Yeah, it was the number 1 seed, but let's be honest, an outside champion should not be struggling on the Ultimate Fighter unless you're facing a Kamaru Usman, which actually happened in the Brazilian top team versus American top team season, but that's a story for another time. So what happened? Why could these dominant champions struggle so badly when they went into the octagon? Most of them flame out pretty quickly. Well, the first reason is the size difference. The reality is fighters don't cut the same amount of weight outside the UFC as they do inside. There really isn't a reason to. And in some promotions like ONE FC, if you actually believe them, they're outlawing weight cutting and just moving everybody up a weight class. Think Jake Shields was the Strikeforce middleweight champion, immediately drops down to welterweight and pretty much spends his entire UFC career there. Dan Henderson, light heavyweight champion, he doesn't get the fight with John Jones, drops down. And you really see this, just look at some of these weigh-ins. And Michael Chandler is deceptive at the weigh-ins because he's standing up straight, but he fights really short. He's a stocky power puncher who bends at the knees and hunches over. So when he faces taller fighters like Charles Oliveira, Paddy Pimblett, he looks a full head shorter. Hector Lombard, yeah, his entire Bellator career was at middleweight, but he was outsized by UFC welterweights. The middleweight was just crazy. He was a full head shorter than them. Lyman Good facing Damian Maia, former middleweight. Will Brooks outside the Nick Lenz fight, where he just had ridiculously low IQ, shooting on a fighter whose signature move is a guillotine. And now Patricio Pitbull just had his debut against Yair Rodriguez, a fighter who's never making 135. Patricio fought for the Bellator 135 championship. So he could have dropped down to 135, and most of his career was at 145, so he thought he'd replicate that success. Instead, he wound up facing a taller, longer, kick-heavy outside fighter. Last time he did that was against AJ McKee, and it did not go well for him. Adding to the size difference is that their styles just don't transfer. The first thing to know about the Bellator style is you have to know Scott Coker's booking style. His philosophy towards booking fights and building stars was to build his champions and individual fighters by giving them a series, by basically throwing fighters at them regardless of quality. For every big win that you would know about, it would have about 4 others that, look good on their highlight reel, but nobody could pick but no real fan could pick them out of a lineup. For every Nick Diaz versus Paul Daly, there's one versus Evangelista Santos, Joaquin Hansen. There were a variety of fighters. Jake Shields, he fought Dan Henderson. He fought Jason Miller. He fought Dan Henderson. But how many of the other fighters he fought on that win streak can you name? How about Gilbert Melendez? He fought Jorge Masvidal. But who else? Josh Thompson. That's about it. These guys had long win streaks that were great for promotional footage, but was it UFC level competition? It was barely Strikeforce level competition. Well, he took that mindset into Bellator, which worked for a time. It built their stars, it built their guys pretty well, and built their highlight reels. And it wasn't too different from the tournament format that Bellator started with. A lot of the guys were unknown, but the ones who came out of it winning would go on to be mainstays. Douglas Lima, Patricio Pitbull, Michael Chandler. These were guys built out of that tournament format, but the aggressive highlight reel focused style did not transfer over to the octagon, where winning was the primary focus, and they struggled to adjust. They were used to dominating the cage. So when they faced fighters that did not go down, they struggled. Patricio could not close the distance well against Yair. Michael Chandler has pretty much been a glass cannon. If you survive him in the beginning, you're going to run away with it. Hector Lombard, when he started going downhill, he really went downhill. And even the ones who actually had some success, Eddie Alvarez, the only one who won the title, he had to pretty much abandon the brawling style. He brawled with Donald Cerrone, lost the fight, and then on his way to the title against Gilbert Melendez and Anthony Pettis, he pretty much adopted a boring wrestler style. Then he won the title through a pretty fluke knockout of RDA and abandoned that. He tries to box up Conor McGregor. That didn't go well. Boxes up Justin Gaethje, which did well, but he took a lot of damage. And then he tries to box Dustin Poirier twice and has to illegally knee him the first time and gets knocked out afterwards. Hector Lombard's biggest success was integrating his judo, but he just couldn't maintain it. And this wasn't unique to the Bellator guys. Justin Gaethje ran into the same issue when he transferred over. So did Marlon Moraes. Gaethje won his first fight in a fight of the year, lost it, got knocked out his next two, and had to slow things down to become a more measured brawler. Now he is what he is now. But very few Bellator fighters could make that adjustment. Even when they did, they struggled to maintain it. But honestly, the most nuanced issue is their price tag. Because these guys were coming into the UFC as former Bellator champions, they didn't come in as debuting prospects as, say, a Cage Warriors champion, a la Paddy Pimblett on a 12-12 contract at the bottom of the card. Now, that's grossly underpaying for even the bottom of the card in the billion-dollar promotion, but what it does is it gives fighters a lot of room to grow because they're just card fillers at that point. Or even a 5-5 Dana White Contenders contract. It gives them room to grow, to adjust, and to build their style, as well as fill out in whatever division they're looking for. Look at Paddy Pimblett. His debut, pretty much it was just waiting for him to get knocked out, and when he wouldn't be able to keep up with the competition as it got better, but he's gotten better each fight. Now he's actually looked at as a title threat. Charles Oliveira looked impressive in the beginning, but he had some really down times on his progression, and so did Dustin Poirier. These guys required time to build up their styles, fill into their divisions, and many of them took losses on the way, but they were able to build themselves back up even better than they were before. In Dustin's case, he started out tiers below Conor McGregor, but years later when they met again, he was on another level. Like, McGregor had no answer in their two fights. That just showed the progression he had made over that time, and pretty much shows the progression you get when you have a more active schedule. Versus these Bellator guys, they're entering as champions of their prior organizations, so they're getting champion money to begin with, and the billion-dollar promotion wants an immediate ROI on that. They're not going to bring someone in like Hector Lombard for $300K for his 2012 debut. They're not bringing a guy in like that expecting him to main event some prelim cards for a few years against unranked opponents. No, they want you an immediate title threat, or at least close to it, which means you don't get many chances if you mess up to build back up. Look at Michael Chandler he wins his 2021 matchup against Dan Hooker, makes $300K to do that, and immediately he's in a title fight against Charles Oliveira. He loses that, gets a fight with, and then he's fighting Tony Ferguson before Ferguson had been knocked out at that time. Then he's fighting Dustin Poirier, Justin Gaethje. Charles Oliveira again. Like, all of these were top 10, top 5 opponents, and then finally he faced a lower tier guy in Paddy Pimblett. He's on a multi-fight losing streak, and he gets dominated by somebody who he didn't think would make it before he retired. Even Eddie Alvarez, yeah, he made $100,000 in his loss to Cerrone, but remember how much that was at the time. Conor McGregor fought on that card, and he was getting $75,000 flat. So Eddie Alvarez was set to make more guaranteed than Conor was. He also got a $250,000 signing bonus. Once again, you don't pay that type of money if you're expecting somebody to need adjustment period, which is exactly what a lot of these guys needed. It puts a ton of pressure on them, which leads to octagon jitters. Yes, these were champions. Yes, they had championship experience. Several of them even went 5 rounds a few times. But there's no contest comparing the UFC environment to Bellator. Through Bellator's existence, their high watermark was a couple events with Kimbo Slice and Royce Gracie, where they broke the mid figures over 1.2 million, and these were sporadic cards. And these big ones were tentpole events. Well, the UFC events happened a lot more frequently, and their average was bigger than Bellator's big fights. So basically, the UFC ran more events. These were bigger events, and these guys were no longer big fish in small ponds. They were pretty much medium-sized fish in big oceans. What's more, they all had targets on their backs because they were entering with really high price tags. Everybody knew it because the UFC would make big announcements about their signings, and the organization would want immediate ROIs, so they would immediately match them over against top guys who would see them as opportunities to shorten their path to the title. Basically, they were faced with make or break pressure, and a lot of them either fell apart or just couldn't match what they had done in Bellator, which is pretty crazy. I mean, for the first part of my conclusion is, when Bellator went head to head with other promotions, they dominated. Like, after PFL bought them and they did the PFL versus Bellator series, the Bellator champs went 5-1 against PFL. The only champ to lose was Ryan Bader, a light heavyweight, going up against the 6'7" super heavyweight PFL champ. And Ryan Bader spent most of his prime years in the UFC. Against Ryzen, they went 9-1 through their co-promotions with them. So these guys, the Bellator champs, and a lot of them were those champs that transitioned to the UFC. These guys were not scrubs by any stretch of the imagination. They were just victims of Bellator's success and the market. They were too big for them to be prospects, to be given the room to grow and develop. They were expected to already have that done and just immediately be top guys. And a lot of them were for their entire career. Their just records didn't pan out that way. But Bellator was also too small for them to get UFC experience. The big show, the big viewership, the attention, the money, all that stuff, and the targets on their backs. Yeah, they were champions. Everyone was gunning for them. But they all knew that the big show was the UFC. And the biggest thing is it really shows the other level the UFC is on, which is pretty obvious in the market, which is why former UFC fighters and champions are getting these crazy numbers thrown at them for influencer boxing or the Grandpa Fighting League, which is falling apart, but that's a video for another time. UFC being where the best fight the best really isn't a marketing gimmick. And when champions from other organizations, even though I think that's the right way to go about the business, is go to a lower level promotion, build your name up so you can demand a higher salary, it isn't showing to be the right way for a long career in the UFC if your goal is championship. But honestly, what do you guys think? Did the Bellator champions really fail in the UFC? They got one champion out of it, which is a lot more than some other promotions had. Was it the size of their competition? Was it the style? Was it the money? Let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, comment, subscribe, and I will see you all in the next one.